In 1923, nestled in the fog-choked hills of Briarstone, the town's asylum held a dark secret. Room 209, once home to the most violent patients, was abandoned, except for one thing. Every night, a nurse named Eleanor stood at the door, feeding an empty bed, whispering to it as if a patient still lay there. It wasn't until her sudden disappearance in 1924 that the truth began to surface, a truth sealed away by the asylum's board, deemed unsuitable for public eyes. I've uncovered footage never meant to be seen. Are you brave enough to uncover the darkness lurking in Briarstone? Comment, I'm ready if you dare. The dust was thick in the Briarstone archives, heavy enough to coat even the truth, to smother the memory of what had been the ivory drawer. Every file seemed to tremble under the weight of its own neglect, as though it feared what might be revealed if disturbed. For decades, no one had thought to search these vaults, where the past was left to rot among yellowed pages and brittle bindings. And yet, the ledger was found, wedged in a forgotten corner, its cover dark with age and something else, something the light dared not touch. The ink had run in some places, as though someone had tried to scrub away what it held. The stain of remorse lingered there still, the smudged words unwilling to reveal their truth. But the name Eleanor bled through the smears, a whisper too loud to ignore. Eleanor. The bed in room 209 was never truly empty. The air in the room felt colder when she read it, colder, and somehow heavier. Sister Agnes moved the page closer to her face, her fingers trembling, not with the chill, but with something far more unsettling. The name had surfaced so many times in whispered confessions, in the traces of shadows that seemed to pass beneath her door at night. But this was not rumor or grief, this was an accusation. She wiped away the thin sheen of dust from the page, though the residue of time stuck like a thin layer of soot to her skin. The ledger, as if alive, seemed to pulse in her grasp. She felt its weight settle deeper into her bones, its presence now impossible to ignore. She was alone, yet she wasn't. The sound of a door creaking echoed in the silent room, though she had not moved. She felt it first in the air, a presence at her back, then the sound, so faint and so familiar, yet so disturbing, the scrape of wood against wood, like nails on stone, like the slow pull of a coffin lid. The door, it seemed, opened on its own, a door that hadn't opened in years, and the silence that followed felt like a breath held just a moment too long. Sister Agnes pulled the ledger closer, feeling its tremor grow in her hands. The entry she read was almost drowned by the ink stains, but the date, 1924, remained clear. The date of the incident, though no one had ever spoken of it aloud. No one could. Not in Briarstone. What had happened in room 209? The names Eleanor, yes, but what of the others? The faces that filled the corners of her memory, the ones who vanished, never to be found in the halls again. A gentle knock at the door. She jumped, though she had not heard footsteps. The door remained ajar, an invitation, but it was not meant for her. She knew that much, just as she knew the words she read were not meant to be unearthed. Not now, not ever. The door creaked again, and the familiar smell of rotting wood filled her senses, the scent of decay that never seemed to leave the walls of Briarstone. No matter how much the nuns scrubbed, no matter how many prayers they whispered, it clung to them, to the lives they lived here, like a stain on their souls, a stain they couldn't wash away. It was cold, too cold for the summer. The chill prickled at her skin, curling in the depths of her bones. But when she looked at the page again, the words seemed to shift. They blurred like the edges of a nightmare, struggling to remain in the light. She reached for the lantern beside her, her hands too slow, too cautious. The dim light flickered, casting strange shadows across the room, shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air thickened as if the very atmosphere were closing in. There were whispers, though none came from her lips. They came from somewhere else. Her breath caught. The page before her had changed, or rather, her mind had changed it. The smear of ink had formed a face, the faintest outline, but there was no mistaking it. It was Eleanor, the woman who had never left room 209. The name, now sharp and clear in the faded ink, echoed through her thoughts, a bell ringing in the silence. And just as the light flickered once more, she saw it, the image of Eleanor, slumped against the bed, eyes wide open, mouth agape in a scream that never reached her lips. There was no escaping that face. It haunted the room like an unspoken prayer, an invocation to something darker. Her fingers moved to close the ledger, but they stopped midway. Beneath Eleanor's name, there was another line, one she had not noticed before. Even though she had read this entry 3 times, it was small, hurriedly written, as though someone had tried to make it disappear. It was no longer legible, but the shape of the words was clear. The bed in room 209 was never truly empty. A soft, melodic hum hummed through the room. Sister Agnes couldn't place it at first. A hymn, perhaps, though she had never heard it sung in Briarstone before. It seemed to come from the very walls, a sound that made her blood run cold. The air felt thick with memories, with things unsaid, with echoes of the ones who had come before her. Their voices had been silenced, some willingly, others with force, but the ledger had survived, the truth had survived, and now it sat in her hands like a curse. Something moved behind her, a presence, a feeling too heavy to ignore. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. The door was still ajar, and the shadows stretched longer now, stretching toward her. It was the sound of footsteps, now slow, deliberate, coming from the hall, but no one was there. Only the stillness, thick as old tar, curling and folding into the corners of the room. Sister Agnes closed the ledger, but the weight remained. The pages were still there, hidden beneath the cover, waiting. The name Eleanor, the stain of memory, and the whisper that would not stop. The bed in room 209 was never truly empty. Her hand trembled as she stood, the lantern casting an uncertain glow across the room. The presence was still there, hanging like a veil over her shoulders. She stepped back, toward the door, but when she looked again, the ledger was gone. The place where it had rested, now only a dark stain on the wooden table. Some things, she thought, are never meant to be remembered. But the name Eleanor lingered in her mouth, like a bitter taste, like something swallowed too fast. It would not be forgotten. It could not be forgotten. And the silence. It too was never truly empty. There were whispers that only the night could carry, murmured from one shadowed corner of Briarstone to another. They were not spoken aloud, for the truth was a thing best left unspoken, but the air itself seemed to hum with the stories of those who worked in the silence of night. The town had its own myths about Briarstone, its own deep-set fears. But it was Eleanor, the new nurse, the one with eyes too wide and hands that never seemed to tremble, who captured their attention. She came in the winter of 1923, her name like a breath against the cold walls of the asylum. Thin and pale, her skin so white it almost seemed to glow under the dim lamps of the hallways. They said she arrived at dusk, her face hidden beneath the brim of her bonnet, as though she feared even the light. She spoke little, her words clipped and precise, her gaze ever restless, as if waiting for something that would never come. She was assigned to the night shifts, a task that no one else seemed to want. Perhaps that was the reason, a quiet resignation in her that matched the grim stillness of Briarstone when the world outside had fallen asleep. But her devotion to the patients, particularly one who had not been seen in months, raised more questions than answers. "There's someone in room 207, she would say, her voice low and unsteady as she passed through the hall, her step soft but deliberate. "She's still alive. I've seen her." The staff did not dare ask her to explain. They had heard such claims before from patients lost to their own minds, from nurses whose fear had led them to imagine the impossible. But there was something in Eleanor's eyes, a depth that unsettled even the oldest of the orderlies. She was not like the others, not like the young faces who came and went like fleeting shadows. She was here for something deeper, something hidden beneath the institution's rotting floors, as if her very purpose was tethered to the darkness that clung to the walls. And so, she walked those hallways alone, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors like a distant prayer. The air was thick with mildew, the smell of old stone and damp paper. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to breathe, though they had not moved in years. In the distance, the soft, steady ticking of an old grandfather clock was the only sound that filled the silence. It was a noise that seemed too loud, too persistent for a place meant to be forgotten. As she passed the wards, the nurses' rooms, the common areas, the quiet seemed to follow her, folding in on itself, as if Briarstone were holding its breath. The flickering gas lamps cast strange, distorted shadows across the walls, creating shapes that danced with no rhythm. There were those who said that the asylum's dark corners held the spirits of those lost within its walls, the ones who had never truly left. But Eleanor saw them, or so she claimed. She spoke of them as if they were friends, as if their suffering was something she could feel, something she could understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was. But none of the other staff saw the patient. In room 207, they had long forgotten her name, long erased her from memory. The woman had been there for months, then suddenly vanished. No one could say when or why. She simply stopped appearing. And yet, Eleanor spoke of her as though she still lingered in that room, still breathing, still alive. It was an obsession, the way she would linger by the door at the stroke of midnight, the way her fingers would trace the frame, as if she were listening for a sound that no one else could hear. One night, Eleanor stopped a passing nurse in the hallway, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. "She's not gone," she whispered. "She's waiting." The nurse, uncomfortable, stepped away without responding. But Eleanor's voice, that low, trembling voice, stayed with her, hanging in the air long after she had gone. The night shifts grew longer, and the shadows deeper. Each evening, Eleanor's figure could be seen moving from room to room, her face flickering briefly in the dim light of the hallway before she disappeared into the darkened wards. The other nurses spoke less and less about her. They avoided her gaze when they passed, their eyes sliding away like oil on water. They did not wish to see the truth she carried, the one that had been buried in Briarstone's dust long before she had ever come. There were moments, though, when Eleanor would stop before an empty room. She would stand in the doorway, her shoulders stiff, her hands at her sides, staring into the abyss as if waiting for a voice that would never speak. There were those who claimed they saw something, just a flicker of movement, a fleeting shadow, but no one dared to question her. To do so would be to confront what they feared most, the asylum itself, the dark void it contained. Eleanor had grown accustomed to the silence, to the oppressive quiet that weighed on her chest as she wandered the halls. Her footsteps were like a hymn that never reached its end, a melody that slipped through her fingers, always out of reach. But on one particularly dark night, as the clock struck 3, something changed. There was a sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper. It came from behind the door of room 207. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something colder than the night itself. She opened the door slowly, her heart beating in her ears. Inside, the room was empty. The bed, neatly made, stood alone in the center. Yet the whispering continued, soft and insistent, coming from somewhere in the room. Eleanor's gaze darted around, her pulse quickening. There, by the window, was a figure, a shape too faint to fully discern, but still there, standing, waiting. Watching, Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as she gasped, the whisper growing louder, more frantic. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the room. The whisper stopped, the silence returned, but Eleanor did not leave. She stood there, staring into the void where the figure had been, her eyes wide, her chest heavy with something unspeakable. She had seen it, heard it, whatever it was real, and in that moment, she knew that Briarstone was not the only thing that had never truly let go. It began as a curious thing, something unnoticed at first, the bed in room 209. Every morning, when the nurses filed in for their rounds, they found it neat, immaculate, as if a soul had just risen from beneath its covers. It was not so much the cleanliness, nor the way the sheets lay so perfectly smooth, but the lingering sense that something had been there. The faint indentation of the mattress where a body had rested, the quiet disarray of the blanket, the small indentation of a pillow, all subtle signs of a presence long gone. And yet, there it was, as if it had been occupied just moments before. The first few mornings, no one spoke of it. A passing oddity. Perhaps the linen crew had made a mistake, or someone had mistakenly entered the room. But when it happened again, the nurses began to exchange uneasy glances. Something about the room, about that bed, felt wrong. But it was Eleanor who paid the most attention. She was always there at dawn, standing by the door as if waiting for someone to arrive. Her pale fingers often lingered at the threshold, brushing the brass handle with a tenderness that unnerved the others. She had grown thinner since she arrived, her face drawn in sharper lines, the circles beneath her eyes dark and persistent, like bruises that would never fade. "There's something wrong with the bed," one of the nurses remarked one morning, glancing at the freshly made linens. "Every night, every morning, it's the same." Eleanor did not respond, her gaze fixed on the bed. Her lips trembled slightly, as though caught between words. "It's just, she never left." The others avoided her eyes, unsure of whether to press further. They did not know which was more unnerving, Eleanor's solemnity or the unnatural stillness of room 209. Yet, every morning, the bed was freshly made, and every night, it felt as if it had been occupied. The days passed slowly, the weight of the silence heavy and constant. Eleanor's behavior became increasingly erratic. Though none of the other nurses dared to confront her, she began to perform strange rituals, walking into the room at dusk, the door closing softly behind her, leaving only the faintest whisper of movement from inside. It was not the ritual that disturbed them, but the way it had become part of the routine. There was no question that she was attending to something invisible, something that the others could not see, and something they were too afraid to imagine. Then, one afternoon, Sister Margaret found the first journal entry, hidden beneath Eleanor's uniform in the laundry room. The pages were thin, yellowed with age, and the ink had faded, though not enough to obscure the desperate scrawl across the page. Sister Margaret, with her usual reluctance to pry, found herself compelled to read it. The words were frantic, wild, a confession of sorts, though not of anything specific. They spoke of dreams, of things that could not be explained, and of a patient named Mary, the one in room 209, who had been placed there months ago. The patient who had vanished. "I cannot leave her alone," Eleanor wrote. "She is still. Here she is, waiting for me. Her bed is never truly empty, never truly still. I must wait for her. I must bring her back." Sister Margaret's stomach churned as she flipped through the journal. The entries grew more erratic, more anguished. Eleanor had begun to write of voices, whispers in the dark, soft and persistent. That promised her the truth, that urged her to stay, to watch over the bed. The tone of the writing shifted slowly from concern to something darker, something that hinted at an unraveling mind. The silence in Briarstone had a way of distorting reality, of twisting it until the walls themselves seemed to close in on the staff. But now, something more sinister was unfolding. The quiet had become oppressive, thick with a sense of anticipation. As Sister Margaret turned the pages, she found herself caught in the same spell that had overtaken Eleanor. The very air seemed to hum with something unseen, something that brushed against her skin like a cold hand. In one of the final entries, Eleanor's writing had become almost illegible, a jumble of words and symbols, broken by long, unnerving pauses. But there was one phrase that stood out, a sentence repeated like a mantra. "She is not gone, she is still waiting." The bed was never empty. Sister Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. The nurse had been more than just obsessed with her patient. She had become consumed by her, as if the bed itself had claimed her, as if the space where the body had once been now held something more. That night, as the rest of Briarstone slept, Sister Margaret made her way down the hallway toward room 209. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and dampness. The gas lamps flickered as if fighting against the oppressive dark that filled the halls, their faint light casting long shadows that twisted along the walls. Her feet moved soundlessly on the worn floorboards, each step seeming to take longer than the last. The silence was so thick it seemed to hum with the promise of things unseen. When she reached the door to room 209, she hesitated. She had not meant to come here, not like this, but there was a pull, a strange compulsion, that made her hand reach for the handle. It was cool beneath her fingers, its surface tarnished with age. She turned it, the sound of the lock clicking too loud in the silence. Inside, the room was as it always was, cold, empty, and unnervingly tidy. The bed lay in the center of the room, its sheets crisp and untouched, but Sister Margaret could feel it. There was something in the air, something that pressed against her skin like a weight. And there, beside the bed, stood Eleanor. She was staring at the bed, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the walls were closing in, as though something or someone was waiting. Sister Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she watched Eleanor move, her hands trembling as they reached toward the sheets. There was no one there, but the bed was not empty. Not now, not ever. And just as Sister Margaret opened her mouth to speak, the whispering began, soft at first, but growing louder, insistent, like the sound of 1,000 voices, murmuring from the corners of the room. "She is not gone. She is waiting." The air grew colder still, and Sister Margaret's legs buckled beneath her. The bed was empty, but Eleanor's eyes, those eyes that had once seemed so full of purpose, were now vacant, hollow. The bed in room 209 had never been empty, not once. The clock struck midnight, its ticking the only sound that dared to echo through the dim corridors of Briarstone. The nurses were accustomed to the quiet, the stifling, almost suffocating silence that hung in the halls like dust. But tonight, it was different. It was as though the silence had grown heavier, pregnant with a secret it was too scared to reveal. Eleanor's footsteps, soft but deliberate, moved down the hall, pausing only when she reached the door to the nurse's room. She stood there for a moment, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The thin fabric of her nurse's uniform clung to her, as though she carried something invisible, but crushing. She had become a fixture here, a shadow that blended with the walls, with the worn floorboards that creaked like old bones. It was hard to imagine her as anything else but part of the asylum, as though she too had been swallowed by its ancient, broken silence. It was not until the sound of her breath caught in her throat that she spoke, her voice low, as if afraid of the words she was about to say. "I've been to room 209, she whispered, her gaze flickering toward the door, but never quite meeting the nurse's eyes. "The bed, it's never empty." Her words hung in the air, thick with something unspoken, something that felt like it might break at any moment. For a long time, the nurse said nothing. She simply stared at Eleanor, her heart heavy with something she could not name. It was not pity, it was not sympathy. It was dread, a creeping unease that made the room feel colder. Though the lamps still burned low, Eleanor's gaze darted toward the window, but her eyes never focused on anything beyond the glass. She seemed to see something else, something that no one else could. A whisper passed through the stillness, the faintest rustling, as if the walls themselves were murmuring. "She's there," Eleanor continued, her voice growing more frantic. "Still waiting. I can hear her in the walls, behind the bed, in the dark." The nurse, a quiet woman named Agnes, moved slowly to the chair beside the table, settling down as though the weight of Eleanor's words had made the air too thick to breathe. She watched her with a mix of concern and something darker, doubt. "Perhaps, Eleanor," Agnes said, her voice measured. "You've been working too many hours. Maybe you're not seeing things clearly." But Eleanor's eyes flared, with a sudden intensity, her chest rising and falling with the weight of something unseen. She was no longer the meek nurse Agnes had once known. This was someone else, someone unraveling. "No," Eleanor replied, her voice rising now, frantic and full of a terror that could not be silenced. "You don't understand. She's not gone. She can't be. I won't let her be. I won't let them forget her." The words came out in a flood, as if they had been trapped for too long behind a wall of her own creation. Agnes tried to steady her thoughts, to wrap her mind around what Eleanor was saying. But it was all so absurd, so terrifyingly irrational. The bed in room 209 had been empty for months. Ever since the woman who had once occupied it, Mary, she remembered now, had been removed. But Eleanor, with her quiet obsession, seemed to refuse to let go of the idea that the woman was still there. The bed was not empty, she claimed. Agnes's breath faltered as she thought of the past. Mary's case had been unusual. The woman had arrived at Briarstone years ago, a violent, unstable patient. Her mind had been fragmented, her spirit broken. Some said she had led a cult, once that she had whispered to shadows and danced in the dark. Others said she had been nothing but a lost soul, clinging to the idea that Briarstone could somehow cure her. But the whispers, the rumors, grew louder after she disappeared. No one ever spoke of it aloud, but there were eyes that glanced away, faces turned from the truth. The walls of Briarstone had swallowed more than they were willing to admit. "Eleanor," Agnes said again, her voice steady. "Mary is gone. She's been gone for months." Eleanor's eyes flashed with something darker now. "She's not gone," she insisted, her hands trembling at her sides. "She's still waiting. I know it. I can feel it in the bed. I can hear her in the dark." For a moment, Agnes felt something cold touch her own thoughts, a creeping feeling that slipped through the cracks of reason. Had they ever truly found Mary's body? Had they buried her? Or had she, too, vanished into the silence, into the walls of Briarstone? But that was absurd, wasn't it? Eleanor took a shaky step forward, her hand reaching for Agnes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "You have to believe me. The bed, it's not empty, it's waiting. She's still there. She won't leave until they remember her." Agnes recoiled slightly, a pang of fear creeping up her spine. There was something unhinged in Eleanor's voice, something frayed and raw. The nurse wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but something held her back. It wasn't pity, it was fear, a fear that seemed to rise from the very air around them. "You're not well, Eleanor," Agnes said quietly, her voice filled with a sadness that wasn't entirely sympathy. "You need rest, you need to stop, for your own sake." Eleanor stood motionless for a long time, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her hands clasped tightly at her sides. The room felt colder still, the silence deeper. "I'll make sure she's not forgotten," Eleanor whispered just before she stepped into the hallway, her words trailing behind her like a fading echo. "I won't let them forget." And then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows that filled the corridors of Briarstone, leaving Agnes alone in the dim room with the suffocating silence that seemed to hold its breath. Agnes sat still, her hands folded in her lap. A shiver crept up her spine as she thought of the bed in room 209, of Eleanor's frantic words. She closed her eyes, but the image of the empty bed, the fresh linens, the quiet stillness remained with her, growing in weight, growing in dread. The silence that followed felt like a promise that something, or someone, had never truly left Briarstone. The fire started quietly, a single spark in the darkness that quickly spiraled into an inferno. It consumed the southern wing of Briarstone Asylum, like a breath too long held, too quick to extinguish. The flames hungrily licked the old wooden beams, their heat pressing against the thick stone walls, as if trying to claw at the past itself. There were screams, too faint to carry far, muffled by the roar of the blaze. But no one saw the beginning, and no one could say where it had truly started. By morning, the damage was done, the wing reduced to little more than a skeleton of charred wood and ashen remains. The fire was an accident, they said, a tragedy, quickly contained. The higher-ups at Briarstone wasted no time in smothering the whispers, sealing off the ruins before anyone could ask too many questions. A spark from an old electrical wire, a careless hand. It was a tale too neat, too simple to argue with, and yet something about it felt wrong. The air smelled of burned memories, and the lingering smoke clung to the walls long after the fire had been doused. There were things in Briarstone that should have burned, things that should have been lost to the fire. But there was one room that remained untouched, spared from the flames as though the fire had no power over it. Room 209. The bed was undisturbed, the linens still crisp, white, unbroken. But when the staff arrived to inspect the damage, they found that the door to that room had been sealed, not with a simple lock, but with strange, intricate markings, as though something or someone had forbidden its opening. The air around the door seemed colder now, more oppressive, and the room beyond felt like a space suspended in time. It was untouched, preserved like a ghost of a past never meant to be recalled. But the markings on the door, the symbols, unfamiliar and ancient, spoke of something far darker, something older than the asylum itself. They were not made by human hands, but by something else, something that belonged to the walls, to the rooms that could never speak. Eleanor had been absent from the scene. She had disappeared into the shadows of Briarstone like a whisper, leaving only traces of her frantic devotion behind. The nurses had not seen her since the fire, but there were rumors that she had been found wandering the hallways, speaking of ghosts and forgotten names. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, as though the world she once knew had slipped away from her, leaving only a hollow shell of who she had been. The staff, too frightened to challenge the sealed door, had no choice but to continue with their duties, ignoring the space that seemed to vibrate with something unspeakable. The walls of Briarstone had always held their secrets, but now, the room beyond that door seemed to hold one more, a secret that no one dared to uncover. Sister Margaret, who had once discovered Eleanor's journal, found herself drawn to the room, as if an invisible thread pulled her toward it. The memory of the bed, of the words Eleanor had whispered, lingered in her mind like a constant ache. She had never fully believed the tales of the asylum's haunted past, nor the whispers of cults and lost souls, but there was something about that room, something that gnawed at her, pulled at her thoughts in ways she could not ignore. One evening, when the halls were empty, Sister Margaret found herself standing before the door to room 209, her hand resting lightly against the cold wood. The markings were still there, the symbols unchanged, as if time had no sway over them. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart thudding against her ribs as she stared at the door, unsure of what to do, unsure if she was meant to open it. The fire had burned away the visible rot, but the silence that followed had made the unseen rot even more palpable. She could taste it now, in the air, in the heavy stillness that surrounded her. The faint smell of ash and soot, mixed with the ever-present scent of mildew that seemed to permeate Briarstone's very foundation. And then, just as she turned to leave, she heard it. A whisper, so soft it might have been the wind. But no, the wind did not speak like that. It did not carry the faintest trace of a name, of something long buried. Sister Margaret. The voice was cold, like ice, yet familiar, though she could not place it. She spun around, her eyes wide, scanning the hallway, but there was no one. There, the door to room 209 remained sealed, its surface undisturbed. The whisper faded, and she was left with only the weight of its echo, a sound that seemed to slide beneath her skin. Her breath caught in her throat. The feeling in the air had shifted again, as though the room was pressing against her, as though it had been waiting for her to listen, to open the door. But she couldn't let herself. Instead, she turned and walked quickly back down the hall, her footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet. The silence behind her felt colder still, the whisper still lingering in her ears. She did not look back. Days passed, and the higher-ups continued to hush any talk of the fire and the sealed room. The staff was told to ignore the strange symbols, to pretend the fire had not happened, as though the past had no right to be remembered. They whispered of other things, mundane things, patience, schedules, the usual hum of bright routines. But there was an unspoken understanding that something had changed, something was wrong. And yet, the room remained locked, untouched by time or fire. Its door was an unspoken boundary, a line that should never be crossed, not by anyone. The markings, the strange symbols, they were a warning, something that had not been meant to be uncovered. The whispers did not cease, for Briarstone's walls had long ago absorbed the ghosts of its past. But now, in the shadow of room 2, those ghosts were not content to stay buried, and somewhere, beneath the silence, there was the faintest sound of something scraping against the door, as if it were waiting to be let out. The clipping was yellowed with age, its edges curled as if it, too, had been consumed by time. It lay forgotten beneath a pile of old papers, buried deep within the asylum's archives, its ink faded but still legible. Eleanor found it one evening, after the others had gone to bed, and the silence in Briarstone thickened like a fog. The newsprint had become brittle, almost fragile in her hands, but the name that leaped from the page was sharp, unmistakable: Isabel Mallory. Isabel had been a patient at Briarstone long before Eleanor's time. Her case was recorded in the asylum's annals, a girl with violent tendencies, whispered to have otherworldly powers. She was brought in after a series of brutal outbursts, a wild thing bound by her own madness. There had been rumors of strange occurrences, unsettling presences around her, things that could not be explained, no matter how hard they tried. She had been confined to room 209, locked away in the shadows, never to be spoken of again. But the clipping told a different story. Eleanor's heart quickened as her eyes scanned the article. It spoke of Isabel's sudden disappearance, the investigation that had been conducted, if it could even be called that. The police, the hospital administration, they had all claimed the matter was too complicated to resolve. The girl, they said, had likely escaped, or worse, fallen victim to her own madness. But there was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever left the room. The search had been brief, and the matter swiftly buried. The words "unexplained disappearance" echoed in Eleanor's mind, reverberating like the last note of a forgotten hymn. She felt something shift inside her, something heavy and unfamiliar, stirring in the pit of her stomach. It was more than just curiosity. It was an obsession, the same obsession that had begun to gnaw at her the moment she stepped into Briarstone. Isabel Mallory was more than just a name. She was the key to something hidden, something that lay buried in the cold stone walls of this place. And now, with the discovery of this newspaper clipping, Eleanor could not ignore it. The bed in room 209, the one she had spent countless hours obsessing over, had been occupied by Isabel, and now it felt like a place where the past and present collided, a space caught between the living and the dead. Eleanor felt a strange compulsion to find out more, to uncover the truth behind the girl's disappearance. She was no longer a nurse at Briarstone. She was a woman possessed by a mystery that refused to be left untouched. Her breath quickened. As she read the clipping again, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and excitement, the article described Isabel's violent outbursts, her strange fits of rage that had sent shockwaves through the asylum. But it was the final line that made Eleanor pause, her pulse racing. Many believed Isabel Mallory had powers beyond the human realm. Some even spoke of her ability to commune with spirits, a madness, or a truth no one dared to speak of. The words stuck to her, haunting her with their strange promise. A woman whose very presence bent the fabric of reality itself. A woman locked away in room 209, a place where nothing was ever truly forgotten. Eleanor could not shake the feeling that the girl's fate was somehow tied to her own. The pull toward that sealed room, the compulsion to uncover the truth about Isabel Mallory, had only deepened. She could feel it in the air, in the space that lingered between the walls of Briarstone. She could almost hear Isabel's voice, soft and echoing, whispering from the shadows. The others had stopped asking her about her late-night walks through the halls. They no longer inquired after her obsession with room 209. But Eleanor could not let it go. She could not stop herself from walking those corridors, tracing her fingers along the walls as if they might hold the answers she so desperately sought. And the whispers, the ones that had followed her since she first entered the asylum, had grown louder. "She's still here," Eleanor would mutter to herself, her voice a fragile thread of certainty. She never left. Her thoughts began to unravel. She found herself wondering if the bed in room 209 had ever truly been empty, or if Isabel's presence, her madness, her otherworldly power, had never really been contained. Eleanor's mind fractured as the walls of Briarstone seemed to press closer, the very foundation of the institution creaking with the weight of its own secrets. She felt it then, in the depths of her bones. The asylum was alive, breathing, alive with a darkness older than any of them could understand. One evening, she stood before the sealed door of room 209. Her hand trembling as it hovered just inches from the strange markings etched into the wood. Her mind raced, her body frozen, as though the room itself was daring her to unlock it, to uncover whatever lay hidden within. For a moment, the silence was absolute. The stillness in the hallway felt suffocating, as though the entire world had paused to watch her. And then, just as she was about to reach for the handle, a voice, faint and distant, seemed to echo from within. It was a whisper, a low, rasping sound, just beyond the threshold. Eleanor, her heart skipped a beat. She recoiled, her breath catching in her throat as the voice lingered in the air, filling the space with an unspoken promise. It was not her name spoken by human lips. It was something else, something ancient, and the darkness in the room seemed to pulse with a hunger that could not be ignored. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing, her thoughts fragmented. The room was not empty. It never had been. And the truth, the one she had been chasing, was slipping further from her grasp, just out of reach. She stood there for a long time, the door before her, the whispers behind it, as if the room itself were alive, waiting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Isabel Mallory's fate was not just a story. It was a warning, a curse, and a name that would not be forgotten. The sealed door of room 209 stood like a barrier between her and the truth, but she could feel it now, the darkness pressing against her, the weight of an unspeakable past, and the creeping realization that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The room was always still, as it had been in the days before Eleanor had arrived. But now, in the middle of the night, there was something more, a silent ritual, repeated every evening without fail. The bed, pristine and untouched by time, waited in the center of the room, its white linens undisturbed, as though it too had grown accustomed to the unspoken presence that visited it nightly. Eleanor placed the basin of milk on the floor beside the pillow, the porcelain rim chipped and stained with remnants of white fluid. The milk had become thick, the surface a layer of cream, like some forgotten offering to a deity that refused to be named. She set it down with reverence, as if the act were a prayer, not one of faith, but of need. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of milk, a smell so cloying it lingered in her lungs, thick and clinging. The very act of setting the basin down seemed to fill the room with a weight, as though the air had grown too dense to breathe. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the sheets, her eyes scanning the room, looking for something she could not name, something that had no form but was always there. She had grown accustomed to the presence, the feeling that someone else was watching her, even when the room was empty. It wasn't the silence that unsettled her, it was the way the room seemed to breathe with her, as though it were alive, echoing with the past. Eleanor's movements were mechanical now, a ritual she could not break. Each night, she returned to room 209 and fed the bed, offering it the milk, as though the room itself hungered for it, as though it demanded the ritual be kept. The act, once strange, had become routine, something she no longer questioned. The milk was her offering. The bed, its hunger. Her thoughts, once clear, were now clouded, fogged over by the pull of the room, by the weight of its walls, its secrets. She no longer understood what she was doing or why. Her gaze, once sharp and bright, had softened. The woman who had entered Briarstone, eager and alert, was gone. In her place was something distant, something lost. Tonight, as she sat by the bed, her hands stained white with the milk, her eyes fixed on the empty pillow, she did not look at the basin. She was too lost in the space beside it, the space where something once was, and might still be. She could feel it there, behind her, just out of sight. The air was thick with the memory of someone who had never truly left, a memory that clung to her, to the room, like dust on the forgotten things of Briarstone. The door creaked open, a sound so faint it might have been imagined, but Eleanor did not flinch. She was no longer surprised by the noise, the whispers, the things that seemed to pass through the room unnoticed by everyone but her. Sister Eleanor, a voice, distant but familiar, cut through the haze of her thoughts. It was Claire, another nurse, her voice trembling with uncertainty. She had found her, again, sitting motionless in front of the bed. Eleanor turned her head slowly, her eyes clouded, unfocused. She did not respond at first, but her lips moved, as if tasting the air, as if trying to find the right words. "I've been feeding it," Eleanor whispered, her voice soft, distant, as if speaking to something invisible. "It needs to be fed. It waits." Claire stepped closer, hesitant, her eyes darting between the basin and Eleanor's hands, now dripping with milk. Her stomach churned at the sight. There was a sickness in the air, something heavy, something unnatural. She had seen the madness in Eleanor's eyes, the way her gaze had hollowed out over the past weeks, but this was different. The woman before her was no longer someone she recognized. "Feed what, Eleanor?" Claire asked softly, though she already knew the answer. She could not stop herself from asking, as if somehow the answer might make things clearer. But the more she spoke, the more she felt a deep, creeping unease. Eleanor's hands dropped to her lap, her fingers slick with milk. She stared at them for a long time, her breath shallow, the silence between them thickening. "The bed," Eleanor murmured, her eyes flicking toward the empty space beside her, as if seeing something Claire could not. "It never stays empty. She won't leave." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the stories, the ones whispered by the staff, the ones that no one dared to speak too loudly. The ghost of room 209, the girl, long gone, whose name had been forgotten, but whose presence remained. Was it madness, or was there something else? Eleanor's voice broke the silence again. "She's waiting for me." Before Claire could respond, she stepped back, suddenly overcome with an unfamiliar chill. The coldness in the room had deepened, and it seemed to crawl beneath her skin, through her bones. She glanced at the floorboards, at the empty space by the bed, and a shiver ran up her spine. Then, something caught her eye. A small piece of fabric, stained with the white residue of spilled milk, had been wedged beneath the floorboards, almost hidden. Claire bent down, her heart racing, her hands shaking as she pried the boards apart with a piece of wood from the corner. The fabric was old, worn, but still damp with milk. She pulled it free, her hands trembling as she held it up to the dim light. It was a fragment of a dress, tattered and torn, stained with something far darker than milk, and beneath the fabric, faint traces of dried blood marred the fabric, an eerie red that seemed to soak into the white, like a shadow that could not be washed away. The room felt colder now, suffocating. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as she held the cloth, her mind racing. The room, the bed, the milk, all of it tied together. A dark thread pulling at the very heart of Briarstone's deepest, most hidden secrets. Eleanor stood, her gaze distant. "She's been waiting for so long." Claire's chest tightened. She looked down at the piece of fabric, at the stains that would never come clean. A voice, faint but insistent, whispered in the back of her mind. Something had been buried here, something more than a body, more than a memory. Eleanor had found it, and now it would not be forgotten. The silence, thick and suffocating, swallowed the room whole. As the bed waited for the next offering, Eleanor's handwriting had changed since the first time she had written to the asylum's board. It was no longer neat and composed, but frantic, wild, as if her pen could not keep up with the thoughts that raced through her mind. The letter had been hidden among other documents, a crumpled relic found in the depths of oldest filing cabinet. The pages, though yellowed, still clung to the edges of her words, sharp, desperate, and too dangerous to be read aloud. The ink was smeared in places, where her fingers had pressed too hard, where the letter had become a vessel for a mind unraveling. She spoke of Isabel Mallory as the one who whispers, a phrase that sent a shiver through the room when first read. Her pen had moved too fast, as if the act of writing itself were an attempt to keep the whispers at bay. "She will not die again," Eleanor had written, her words trembling. "Not if I can help it. I will keep her here. She will not be forgotten. The walls will remember her." The words were haunting, their meaning unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. Eleanor, in her growing madness, had become fixated on a patient who had long since disappeared. The very thought of Isabel, of her violent outbursts and whispered powers, had somehow taken root in Eleanor's mind, anchoring itself there like an unshakable shadow. Beneath her trembling words, Eleanor's tone grew more accusatory, more certain. She wrote as if speaking to the board, but it was not them she was addressing. It was the walls of Briarstone itself, as if the building itself were her audience, as though it could hear her plea. "You have buried the truth," she wrote, "but it will not stay buried. Not this time. Isabel is the one who whispers, and I will not let her die again." A faint tremor rippled through Eleanor's body as she read the letter. The weight of it settled on her chest like a stone, and she couldn't help but feel the growing tension between the institution's leaders and herself. Briarstone had always been a place of silence, a place where things were hidden, forgotten, suppressed. It was not the place for truth, not the kind Eleanor was chasing. But she could not stop herself. The letter was a fragment, torn from its final pages, as if someone had made sure it would never reach its intended destination. Perhaps the board had read it. Perhaps they had seen the growing darkness in Eleanor's words. She had never meant for it to be found, but it had been, and it now rested in her hands, heavy with the weight of something better left buried. The contents of the letter suggested a depth of knowledge the institution had worked hard to conceal. Eleanor's letter referenced Isabel Mallory's strange behaviors and her whispers, things the staff had heard in hushed tones but dared not acknowledge. Isabel was the patient who never left, the one whose presence seemed to haunt room 209 like an unspoken memory. The institution had silenced her, had kept her story hidden for years. But Eleanor, in her unraveling state, refused to remain silent. She wrote of the institution's complicity, of how they had chosen to bury the truth, to pretend Isabel had never existed, never spoken, never been. Eleanor's obsession with Isabel, with the room, had grown, twisting into something darker. The more she delved into Isabel's past, the more she saw her, the girl with the whispers, the one who had been buried by the walls of Briarstone. It was as though Isabel's presence was now a shadow in Eleanor's mind, a shape she could not escape. In the dim light of the archives, Eleanor felt a shift, a darkness pressing in. The walls of Briarstone had always felt alive, but now they seemed to pulse with something else, a hum beneath the floorboards, a whisper from the cracks in the walls. She could hear it now, louder than before, as if Isabel's presence had seeped into her soul. A soft creak echoed in the hallway, though no one else was there. Eleanor closed her eyes, her hand trembling as she set the letter down on the dusty table. She could hear the echoes of her own thoughts, the relentless whispers that filled her mind. "She won't die again," she repeated softly, her voice a prayer, a plea, a warning. The words on the page, the letter she had written, seemed to live with her, to breathe with her. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the walls of Briarstone were not just made of stone and wood. They were made of secrets, of memories that refused to stay buried, of things that had never truly been forgotten. She stood, the letter forgotten, for a moment, her gaze wandering to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to bend and shift. The air felt colder now, the silence thicker. It was there again, the presence, the feeling of someone watching her, of something waiting. For her, it felt like a presence, but one she could not name. She stepped toward the corner, her eyes narrowing as she studied the darkness. The whispers were louder now, impossible to ignore. They seemed to seep from the walls themselves, curling into her ears like fingers, pulling at her thoughts, pulling at her mind. A faint scratching sound broke the stillness, a sound so soft, so faint, it might have been imagined, but Eleanor did not move. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the shadow in the corner, the place where the whispers came from. It was as though the room itself was alive, breathing with her, watching with her. And then, as though it had always been there, something shifted beneath the floorboards. Eleanor knelt, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the wood. There was a crack in the floor, a narrow gap between the boards. She could hear the scraping, the sound of something being pulled, something being hidden. Her breath caught in her throat as she pried the boards apart, her hands shaking. The scent of milk, so thick it clung to her senses, filled the air again, heavy and cloying. Beneath the floor, hidden in the darkness, was a small piece of fabric, stained with milk, and something else, something darker. The fabric was tattered, torn, soaked with memories that could not be washed away. Eleanor's hands hovered above it, her pulse quickening, her mind racing. The whispering in her ears grew louder, as though it was speaking directly to her now. She will not die again, it seemed to say. She will never die. Eleanor's fingers closed around the fabric, and the world seemed to close in on her. The darkness pressed in, and the whispering, it was all around her now, suffocating, relentless. In the echo of absence, she finally understood. The truth was never meant to be buried, and yet, here it was, waiting for her, just as it had always been. Briarstone's walls had been built on silence. Its foundation, forged from stone and rusted iron, was laid in the quiet belief that some things were better forgotten. But silence, like the dark, grew more potent the longer it was fed. And so, in the year of its founding, the institution had begun its descent, a descent into something darker, something older than the ideals of charity and care its founders had once espoused. The institution had been created under the guise of a haven for the unfortunate, the destitute, the broken, the unwanted. They were all sent to Briarstone in hopes of being saved. Its founders, men of great wealth and influence, spoke often of their mission to mend the minds of those who had lost their way, of their plans to transform the institution into a sanctuary for those whose souls had been shattered by life's cruelty. But the truth was never as simple as it appeared. Briarstone's origin was laced with a darkness that had nothing to do with charity. Its true purpose was one of containment, of control. The founders had ties to something far more sinister, a cult whose belief in power through fear permeated everything the institution became. The cult's doctrine was built on the idea that the mind could be reshaped, bent to the will of those who understood its weaknesses. Fear was their tool, and silence their weapon. The walls of Briarstone became not a place of healing, but a labyrinth designed to hold the broken, the vulnerable, and the maddened in a grip from which they could never escape. The cult's influence was felt in the way Briarstone was constructed, a sprawling, maze-like structure, where each corner was made to feel more oppressive than the last. The rooms were small, suffocating, each one holding secrets that no one dared to speak. The founders' beliefs in controlling the mind through isolation, through deprivation, shaped the very essence of the institution. But these were not mere ideas, they were rituals, secret rites passed down through generations, enacted in dark corners, whispered in the stillness between breaths. It was said that they could change a person with nothing more than a look, a gesture, a word that burrowed deep into the soul, like a splinter that festered. And though the cult's reach was never fully known, its presence remained. It had been buried in the very bones of Briarstone, in the very stone beneath its foundations. As the years passed, Briarstone's true purpose was obscured by its charitable reputation. The whispers of its origins, of the cult's dark influence, grew fainter, swallowed by the institution's ever-deepening silence. But not all the ghosts had been erased. Eleanor had found them. She had begun to piece together the fragments of Briarstone's history, uncovering remnants of the past, torn letters, faded documents, and rumors that clung to the shadows of the institution. But it was the discovery of Isabel Mallory's name that had awakened something in her, something buried deep beneath the layers of silence. Isabel, the girl with the whispers, the one who had once occupied room 209. She had been one of the earliest patients at Briarstone, brought in after a series of violent outbursts, strange behaviors that defied explanation. Some said she had powers, an ability to communicate with spirits, to reach into the unseen world. Others whispered of her being touched by something otherworldly, of her connection to forces far beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. But none of this could be confirmed. No one dared to speak of it aloud, and so her memory was buried beneath layers of forgotten history. It was in the quiet corners of Briarstone's archives that Eleanor began to uncover the truth. Isabel Mallory's disappearance was never fully investigated. The records were vague, incomplete, as if someone had deliberately erased her from history. Eleanor began to connect the dots, to see the pattern in the things that were never said. Briarstone had not simply contained its patients, it had shaped them, broken them, remade them in the image of its twisted beliefs. Isabel's power, her connection to the unseen, had been too dangerous to leave unchecked, and so, like so many before her, she had been silenced, erased from the records, her memory buried beneath the weight of Briarstone's dark legacy. But Eleanor would not let her die again. She had become consumed by the girl's memory, by the power that lingered in the empty space of room 209. It was there that the whispers had started, soft at first, like a murmur just beyond her reach. But as time passed, they grew louder, clearer, until Eleanor could hear them as if they were spoken directly into her ear. And it was there, in the shadow of room 209, that Eleanor's madness began to mirror something far older, something that had been growing in the silence of Briarstone for centuries. She had become a vessel for the darkness the institution had sought to bury, for the power that had once been wielded by the founders, the power to control the mind through fear, through isolation, through ritual. The whispers of Isabel Mallory had awakened something in her, something ancient, something that could not be undone. Eleanor's obsession with the room, with the girl, had become a sickness, a compulsion that refused to be silenced. And in her madness, she began to understand the true nature of Briarstone, the cult of silence that had shaped it, that had twisted it into something unrecognizable, something that no longer cared for healing, but only for control. The asylum's walls had been built to contain its inhabitants, but they had also been built to contain its secrets. And now, those secrets were rising to the surface. Isabel Mallory, the girl who had never been allowed to speak, would not be silenced again. Eleanor stood in the hallway before the sealed door of room 209, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her felt thick, oppressive. The whispers were louder now, as if they were calling to her, urging her to open the door. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the wood, and in that moment, she understood. The power she had felt, the connection to the unseen world, had always been there, buried beneath the silence, beneath the walls. Briarstone's true purpose had never been to heal. It had always been to control, to suppress, to bury what could not be understood. The cult of silence had never truly left, and now it was calling her to open the door. The ruins of the southern wing were a forgotten relic, swallowed by the weight of time and the slow crumbling of Briarstone's soul. What remained of the building seemed to sigh under its own decay. The remnants of what once stood proudly, now barely visible beneath the dust, the soot, and the rotting beams. It was in this forsaken corner that something was found. It was not a patient's journal, nor a nurse's report, but a priest's diary, wrapped in leather so old it had cracked under its own weight. The pages inside were stained with age, with time, with the forgotten prayers of a man long buried. The priest had written in a precise hand, but his words grew more erratic as the ink darkened, as though the very act of writing had begun to unravel him. The final pages, smudged, torn, as though someone had hastily ripped them away, held the most disturbing truth of all. The priest spoke of rituals, of a dark presence that had once been summoned within the walls of Briarstone. He had written of a ritual that took place in room 209, a ritual centered around Isabel Mallory. The priest, in his unwavering belief in the institution's power, had performed the rite with the other members of the cult who had secretly established Briarstone. His words were chilling, each sentence dripping with a mix of reverence and fear. "They say she would not die," the journal read. "We tried, but she would not die. We offered her to the dark, but she was untouched, her flesh unbroken, her spirit unwilling to be subdued. Isabel Mallory is not of this world, nor can she be bound by it." The page was stained with something darker now, perhaps the priest's own blood, or the fear that had bled from him as the ritual went awry. The entry continued in jagged lines, speaking of failed attempts, of offerings made, of incantations that refused to work. The cult had believed that fear was a key to controlling minds, But what they hadn't anticipated was Isabel's strength. She had been a conduit for something otherworldly, something the cult could neither understand nor control. Her power is not ours to wield, the journal continued. And so, the walls of Briarstone have been made to contain her, to keep her here. It is not the patient who must be silenced, it is the room itself. It is the bed that she occupies. The priest's words became less coherent, his belief giving way to something darker. The writing turned frantic, desperate, as if the very act of confronting the truth of the ritual had broken him. He had not been able to erase the mark Isabel had left upon the asylum. The ritual he had written was never meant to work. It was not meant to contain what could not be contained, and so, the last line came not in words of wisdom, but of dread. She is the one who waits, and when the bed is empty, she will be released. Eleanor had found the journal among the ruins, though she had not known at first what it meant. Her obsession with room 209, with the bed, had only grown, and now the connection was undeniable. The whispers had grown louder, and the voice that had once spoken to her faintly was now unmistakable. She will be released, she whispered to herself, her fingers trembling as she traced the words, as though somehow the journal itself held the key to her unraveling. The whispers called to her from the room, from the bed that had never truly been empty. They were clearer now, sharper, as though the walls themselves were echoing with the voices of the past. She had been sitting by the bed again that evening, her fingers soaked in milk, when the trance-like state overtook her. She spoke the words of the journal, each sentence flowing from her lips as though they had always been a part of her. She did not know when she had first heard the whispers, nor when they had become her own thoughts. But now she understood. The ritual, the cult, the sacrifices, they were all tied together. Isabel Mallory had never been truly gone. She had been waiting. The bed, the empty bed, had marked the place where she was bound, and the power that had once been contained by the walls of Briarstone was slipping free, slipping into Eleanor, into her thoughts, her breath. Her hands shook as she stood up from the bed, the milk spilling from the basin, staining the sheets. She looked down at the white marks her fingers had left behind, and for the first time, she saw the connection. She was not simply haunted by Isabel's memory. She was the vessel, the one chosen to carry the darkness forward. The bed, once empty, had marked her as its next inhabitant. It was no longer a space to be filled with the past. It was now a place for the future. Eleanor moved toward the door of room 209, her movements slow, deliberate. She had to know, had to understand what had happened all those years ago, what the cult had tried to do. The priest's journal had given her the pieces of the puzzle, but now she needed to see it for herself. She needed to feel the weight of the room, of the place where the ritual had failed, where Isabel had been left to wait, to whisper, to be reborn. The room was cold, the walls thick with dust, the silence oppressive. She stood in the doorway, staring at the bed. It looked unchanged, untouched by the passage of time. And yet, something was different. The air was heavier here, as though the room itself had been waiting for her. She crossed the threshold, her feet moving as if they knew the path, as if the room was calling her to it. The whispers swirled around her, louder now, clearer. They were her thoughts, her voice, and yet they were not hers at all. They were the voice of something buried, something that had waited in the shadows, hidden from view. Eleanor, the voice whispered. She turned toward the bed, her breath quickening, her heart pounding in her chest. The sheets shifted as if a body had been there, as if someone had lain there just moments before. The marks left behind were faint, barely noticeable, but they were there, and then she saw it. The bed was not empty. The space where Isabel Mallory had once lain was now filled with something else, something that had never truly been gone, something that had always been waiting. The mark of the empty bed was not the absence of a body. It was the presence of something darker, something that would never be erased, never be silenced. The room had kept its secret, and now the secret was hers to carry. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, like the faintest tremor in a shadow. Eleanor was missing. It was an absence that none could have predicted, nor prepared for. It was not the kind of disappearance that came with the door left ajar, or a window broken. No, Eleanor's absence was quieter, more insidious. She was simply gone. The morning shift arrived with its usual hum, the nurses moving like ghosts through the halls, their footsteps muffled by the heavy carpet. The air in Briarstone was always thick, stifled by a kind of perpetual dusk. and the morning felt no different. But something was wrong. The place felt colder than usual, the silence deeper. The staff moved through the institution's halls, speaking in hushed tones, though none dared to acknowledge the unease gnawing at their insides. It was Sister Agnes who found the uniform first, Eleanor's shift garb, neatly folded, lying on the floor of room 209. The once pristine white fabric was now smudged with a stain of milk, still faintly smelling, as though it had been freshly spilled. The bed, as it had been so many times before, was freshly made, the linens smooth and untouched, the pillow fluffed just so. Eleanor's uniform lay discarded, as if she had simply stepped out of it. But where had she gone? Sister Agnes picked it up with trembling hands, an uneasy shiver crawling up her spine. She glanced at the bed, the place where Eleanor had spent so many hours, and felt an unease settle like a weight on her chest. Something was not right. Something had happened here, in this room, something that could not be explained away. Her eyes moved toward the floor, where a letter had been placed beneath the bed, barely visible under the shadows. The paper was thin and worn, but the handwriting on it was unmistakable. "I must stay. I cannot leave her." The words were written in Eleanor's hand, frantic and desperate, as if the very act of writing them had drained all the life from her. The letter seemed to pulse with its own weight, a silent confession that filled the room with a quiet terror. "Eleanor," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice barely a breath. She stepped back from the bed, her eyes darting to the walls of the room, as if the answers might be hidden there. The silence in the room felt suffocating now, thick as smoke. It was as if the room itself had become a tomb, holding its secrets, refusing to let them escape. The letter spoke of Isabel, the girl who had never truly left, the one who had once occupied the bed, the one who had never been allowed to die. The whispers had always been there, even before Eleanor's obsession. But now, they had grown louder, sharper. The walls seemed to hum with them, vibrating in the dark, like something alive, something waiting. Sister Agnes stood frozen, the letter heavy in her hands. She wanted to leave the room, wanted to forget the haunting words, but she couldn't. Something in the air, something in the room kept her rooted in place. It was as if the walls themselves were pulling her in, demanding she understand what had happened, what Eleanor had discovered in the solitude of room 209. She turned to leave, but froze in her tracks. Her eyes fell on the symbols, scratched into the walls. They were faint, barely visible at first, but once seen, they couldn't be ignored. The symbols were crude, scrawled with frantic strokes, like someone desperate to leave a mark, to speak a truth that could not be uttered aloud. They twisted in on themselves a language of desperation, a language that spoke of things better left buried. Sister Agnes reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the wall. The symbols seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as if the very stone had absorbed the dark knowledge, the memory of things unspeakable. A cold chill ran through her veins as she traced one of the marks, a symbol that was both familiar and foreign. She had seen it before, in the old priest's journal, the one that spoke of the ritual, of the dark cult that had once held Briarstone in its grip. The cult, the whispers, the ritual that had failed. All of it came crashing down on her in that moment, as if the weight of Briarstone's secrets were finally too much to bear. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in as the silence became unbearable. She could feel it now, the presence of something that had always been there, something that had never been allowed to leave. Eleanor's disappearance was not an accident. It was not a simple flight from responsibility. No, it was part of something much darker, something that had always been part of Briarstone. Eleanor had not run away. She had been claimed. The walls of Briarstone had long ago learned how to hold their secrets, how to bury the truth beneath layers of silence and fear. And now, that silence had claimed another victim. The bed in room 209 was empty again. But Sister Agnes could feel it. The absence was not empty at all. It was filled with something else, something far older than the institution itself, something that had waited in the shadows, hidden behind the walls. Sister Agnes turned and fled the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen enough. She had felt the darkness that had claimed Eleanor, and now it was too late. Briarstone had always been a place of silence, but that silence was not peace. It was a prison, and no one, not even Eleanor, had been able to escape it. As she ran down the hall, the whispers followed her, soft and insistent. They were Eleanor's voice, but they were also the voice of something far darker, the voice of the one who had never left, the voice of Isabel Mallory. And in the distance, in the quiet of the asylum, the bed in room 209 waited for the next offering. Doors had long since been shut, the last of its inhabitants removed in haste, the walls now nothing but witnesses to a forgotten tragedy. The institution had ceased its operations quietly, the administration releasing only murmurs about renovations and restructuring. The truth, however, was far more sinister, hidden behind a veil of official silence and red tape. Number 1 had questioned the sudden closure. The asylum's secrets had been buried in a manner just as discreet, just as careful, as everything else Briarstone had ever been. But even in its abandonment, Briarstone never truly let go. There was always something left behind, something that lingered, something that could not be erased, even by the passing of time. For beneath the rot and the dust, the memories of those who had been confined within its walls never truly faded. The very stones of the building seemed to hum with them, as though the institution had absorbed its darkness like a sponge. And now, in the emptiness, that darkness was all that remained. It was during a final, mournful sweep of Briarstone's old archives that something was uncovered. A forgotten compartment, hidden behind a wall of dust and forgotten paperwork, revealed a box, unmarked, plain, and yet heavy with significance. Its contents were unsettling. An old hymn book, its cover cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. What struck the discoverer first, however, was the smell that wafted from the book, a faint, acrid scent, as if it had been soaked in something far darker than ink. As the box was opened, the hymn book fell open to a page that had been carefully preserved. Its ink was still vivid, but there was something off about the text, something that seemed almost wrong. The music notations, the carefully written words, seemed to dance on the page, an eerie rhythm that did not quite belong to the hymns it was supposed to accompany. And then, there were the stains, dark smears that marred the pages, almost too perfect, too consistent, to be mere accidents. The stains were not ink, they were something else, something more visceral, something that could not be scrubbed away. As the book's pages turned, one passage stood out. The final entry, written in shaky, almost unreadable handwriting, seemed to have been scrawled in a hurry, but its message was chilling, unmistakable. The bed is never empty. The whispers never die. The words seemed to hold a weight all their own, as if they were etched in the very air around the book. The words were not simply an observation, but a warning, a command, a remembrance. The hymn book had been left behind. No one knew why. Perhaps it had been forgotten, left in haste during the closure, or perhaps it had been left for someone else to find. But what it revealed was undeniable, the legacy of Briarstone's darkest past. The very essence of its twisted foundation was sealed in this forgotten relic. The bed, the whispers, the words had always been there, waiting, as if they were part of the building itself. In the stillness of the abandoned archive, the air seemed to grow heavier, the scent of dust mixed with something darker, something like old blood. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, to move, and for a fleeting moment, the silence was broken by a faint sound, a whisper that couldn't be quite placed, a sound so familiar, yet too distant to define. It was as if the building itself had exhaled, as if Briarstone was alive, breathing once again. As the book was closed, the light from the dusty windows flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The whispers, though faint, seemed to grow louder, pressing against the air. There was a sensation of being watched, a feeling of being surrounded, of being lost in the echoes of the past. The mark of Briarstone's haunting was not just in the walls, not just in the empty rooms. It was in the very things that had been left behind, in the forgotten books, the hidden compartments, the places where truth had been buried beneath layers of silence and shame. But the truth could never stay buried, not forever, not in Briarstone. As the hymn book was returned to its box, it was as though the weight of Briarstone itself had shifted. The building had always been a monument, to silence, to control, to the manipulation of minds. But now, it seemed that the walls had absorbed everything, the rituals, the whispers, the power that had once held its prisoners captive. The very air in the room felt thick, as though it had been soaked in the secrets of those who had passed through Briarstone's gates. The box was sealed once again, its contents hidden away in the shadows of Briarstone's archives, just as the institution's past had been buried beneath the weight of its walls. But the whispers didn't stop. They never died. The asylum's administration might have closed the doors, might have sealed away the memories of those who had been contained there, but Briarstone had a way of remembering what was never meant to be remembered. The bed was never empty, the whispers never died, and as the building lay silent, its story was waiting, hidden in the dark corners of its walls, in the dust of its forgotten rooms, in the very air that had once been filled with the sounds of its madness. The final sealing had been performed, but the story had not ended. Not yet. The walls of Briarstone had never truly been empty. Even now, as the building stood abandoned, its silence hummed with the echoes of its past, a past that could not be erased. The air was thick with dust, yet it held something more, something older, something that the passage of time had failed to cleanse. In this silence, the truth had always remained, buried deep beneath layers of memory and darkness. I returned to Briarstone, not out of a sense of resolution, but rather a compulsion I could not ignore. The whispers had grown louder with every passing night, their call becoming a part of me, an anchor that kept me tethered to the place I had hoped to forget. The secrets I had uncovered, the rituals, the faded journals, the strange symbols, etched into the walls had left me hollow, unsettled, unable to leave the questions unanswered. What had truly happened to Eleanor? What was it about Isabel Mallory that had bound her so tightly to this place? As I walked through the crumbling halls, I could almost feel the weight of the past pressing against me, as though the walls themselves remembered what had been done here. The air was thick with mildew and the scent of decaying wood, but there was something else, something darker, lingering just beneath the surface. The quiet of the building felt like a weight, suffocating, as if the silence itself had become a living thing, one that fed on the memories it had kept hidden for so long. I reached room 209, the room where everything had begun, where the echoes of Eleanor's obsession and Isabel's suffering had first taken root. The door, long sealed, stood before me, its wood cracked and weathered, yet still solid, a barrier between the past and the present. I could feel it, the weight of what lay beyond it, pressing against me, urging me to open it. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I reached out to touch the door, as though something was calling me to do what I had come to do, to finally confront whatever it was that had haunted this place. I hesitated, my hand lingering on the cold brass handle. The memories of Eleanor, her frantic obsession, her descent into madness, filled my mind. The bed, freshly made, as though someone had been lying there, the strange symbols scratched into the walls, it all seemed to swirl together in a single, unrelenting wave of fear. The room held its secrets, its darkness, and I had come to uncover them, even if it meant losing myself in the process. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound piercing the stillness of the room. As the door creaked open, the air inside seemed to shift, heavy with the weight of years of silence. The room had not changed. The bed was still freshly made, the linen smooth and unbroken. The only sign of the past was the faintest trace of milk, stained into the fabric, as though someone had recently spilled it. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in, suffocating. It was as if I could feel the presence of Eleanor, of Isabel, both of them trapped here, bound by the ritual that had failed, their fates sealed. Within these walls, I could hear it now, the faint whispers, as though they were coming from behind the very walls themselves, echoing through the room, through the floorboards, through my mind. They never leave, the whispers seemed to say, they never leave. Moved toward the bed, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the sheets. They were smooth, cold to the touch, but there was something unsettling about them, something that did not belong. I pulled back the sheets, my breath catching in my throat. Beneath the pillow, hidden in the folds of the blanket, was a piece of paper, crumpled and worn. The ink faded almost beyond recognition. I unfolded the paper, my hands shaking as I read, the words written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I must stay. I cannot leave her. The words felt like a punch to my gut, a confirmation of what I had feared. Eleanor had not run away. She had not left on her own. She had stayed. She had stayed in the place that had consumed her, in the place that had consumed Isabel. And now, as I stood there, the weight of her words, her final plea seemed to fill the room with a sorrow too deep to comprehend. But it was the next thing I noticed that made my blood run cold. On the walls, hidden in the corners of the room, were more symbols, more marks etched into the wood and plaster. They were not random. They were the same symbols I had seen in the journal, the same ones that spoke of rituals, of dark rites performed to summon and bind the unseen. The marks seemed to pulse with an energy that could not be explained, as if the very walls were alive, as if they were holding something back. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were coming from all around me. I could feel them pressing against my mind, clawing at my thoughts, dragging me deeper into the darkness of this place. It was as though I could hear Eleanor's voice now, clear and trembling, speaking words I could not understand, words I did not want to understand. I looked toward the door, the only way out, but it seemed as though the room had shifted. The shadows had grown longer, the light from the broken windows flickering, as though they, too, were unsure of what was happening here. The bed was never empty. The whispers never die. The words echoed in my mind, a final realization, a truth too terrible to accept. Eleanor had not been the only one who had been claimed by this place. Isabel, too, had been bound to it, to the ritual that had never worked, to the darkness that had never been fully contained. And now, the room, the bed, had claimed me. I could feel it, the weight of it, the pull toward something I could never escape. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was left alone in the darkness, the whispers closing in around me, filling the room with their cold, unrelenting voice. I was not alone. I would never be alone again. Briarstone Asylum stood abandoned, its crumbling walls bearing the scars of time and neglect. The grounds, once manicured and well kept, had long since given way to the encroaching wilderness. Ivy crawled up the stone facades like fingers grasping to hold on to something that had long since slipped away. The windows, once filled with light and life, now stared out vacantly into a world that had forgotten them. There was no one left to mourn its decay, no one to tend to the institution's rot. And yet, the whispers lingered. I had returned, though I should not have. The asylum's secrets had already consumed me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, twisting my sleep into waking nightmares. There was something in the silence of Briarstone, a presence that seemed to seep from the very walls, an echo of the horrors that had unfolded there. Eleanor's name clung to the air like smoke, and Isabel Mallory's whispers filled the empty rooms, murmuring of things too dark to be spoken aloud. I moved through the halls, my footsteps muffled by the dust, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something colder, something that smelled like death itself. The place was still, too still, but there was a weight in that stillness, a presence that hadn't left, couldn't leave. It pressed on me, a pressure in my chest that only grew heavier with each step. The memories of what had transpired in Briarstone's walls seemed to swirl in the air, suffocating, reminding me that the true horror of this place was not simply in the past. It lingered, trapped within the very fabric of the asylum. I stopped at room 209, the place where everything had begun. The door, now shattered and ajar, was a reminder of the secrets it had once held. The room had not changed. The bed, freshly made, sat in the center of the space, as if waiting for someone to lie in it, to occupy the space that had never truly been empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, to flicker as though something breathed there, something alive and aware. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, and the whispers rose again, louder this time, as if they recognized me, Eleanor, Isabel. The room itself seemed to pulse with their presence, with the memories they had left behind. The bed was unchanged, the linen smooth and untouched, but it was the basin on the floor that caught my eye. It was there, as it had always been, beside the bed. The milk still faintly visible, still lingering in the shallow basin, the smell thick in the air. It was as though the ritual, the offering, had never ceased. The whispers came clearer now, their voices blending together, murmuring in my ear, filling my thoughts. "She never left," they said. "She is still here. You are still here." I moved toward the basin, kneeling beside it. The milk had begun to curdle, its surface broken by a thin film of dust. The scent was overpowering, cloying, as if it had soaked into the very air of the room. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't breathe without tasting it, without feeling the weight of it in my lungs. As I stared into the murky liquid, a flash of memory flickered. Eleanor's frantic words, her desperate obsession, the note she had left behind. I must stay. I cannot leave her. The note had been a warning, but it had been too late then. The truth had already taken root, and there was no escaping it now. The ritual, the sacrifice, it had all led here, to this room, to this moment where the echoes of the past had trapped me in a cycle that could not be broken. The walls groaned, the air growing heavier, thicker. I could feel it now. The room, the very fabric of Briarstone, was alive with the energy of what had transpired. The darkness that had been contained, that had been buried beneath layers of silence, was now rising again, flooding the room, flooding me. The bed was never empty. The whispers never die. I looked down, my hands trembling, the edges of my vision blurring as the room seemed to shift around me. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I turned, my breath catching in my throat. In the corner, faintly illuminated by the dim light, I saw her, Eleanor. Her figure was barely discernible, a shadow in the room, but I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze on me. She was still there, just as I had feared. She had never truly left, and neither had Isabel. Their fates were bound to this place, to the bed, to the whispers. They were trapped here, as I was now unable to escape the cycle that had been set in motion so many years ago. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the basin, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. "She will never leave," they said. "She will never let you go." I felt it then, the weight of their words, the realization that Briarstone's horrors had never ended, that they would never end. The silence of this place was not empty. It was full, brimming with the memories, the suffering, the rituals that had taken place here. The asylum had been a prison, yes, but it was more than that. It was a tomb for the living, for the dead, for those who had been trapped in its walls. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I turned, my heart racing in my chest, but there was no escape. The room was closing in around me, the air growing thick with the weight of the past. The bed was never empty. The whispers never die. I stood, my breath shallow, my mind spinning, and in that moment, I understood. Briarstone was not just a place. It was a memory, a living, breathing thing that had absorbed all the darkness, all the terror of its history. And now, as I stood in the heart of its silence, I realized that the true horror of Briarstone was not just in the past. It was in the echoes that remained, in the voices that continued to call, in the cycle that could never be broken. The whispers would never stop, and neither would the silence.